my screen and hopefully this will go smoothly. Okay, so what are we talking here today? So today the topic of this presentation is genealogy, OSINT, and social engineering potential. And we're going to basically cover 3 points. We're going to start to talk about how genealogy and OSINT have so much in common, despite what you may be thinking. Then we'll go through some tools and resources that can help you, connected to genealogy, that can help you in your OSINT investigations. And then at a third point, we're going to talk about social engineering and the potential of genealogy as a pivot point for social engineering. All through this, of course, we have to acknowledge ethical concerns. So despite everything we're going to show you here, always do this kind of research and investigations, considering ethical boundaries and respect for others. So let's get started. And to get started, I really want to talk a little bit about myself, and maybe that's kind of like not very humble, but it is important because I bet that on the other side there's a lot of you that do OSINT, and maybe you are in a job that you don't like that much, or you would like to broaden your scope and you don't really know what to do with OSINT. But actually you can do everything, right? I mean, that's the amazing thing about OSINT. And the connection to genealogy is actually an interesting story, because I worked in law enforcement for 12 years, like doing research on terrorists and organized crime and spies and all those really interesting things. But at a certain point, I really wanted a change, and I wanted a little bit better of a family life. And I actually went to academia, and I went to study in Lisbon, where I do some research now. But for the last 2 years, I've kind of started to develop a hobby that now is a company in genealogy, because I always kind of love genealogy. And currently I have a company that actually employs 15 people, and that is doing quite well. And I want to leave this story with you just because I want you all to feel that, despite the fact that maybe you feel that you can apply it to your job, or you cannot make of OSINT a living, despite the normal areas where we usually see OSINT, like journalism investigation, or like cybersecurity or law enforcement, but there's a lot of things that you can do. So that's how we're going to start our talk today. So about how OSINT applies to genealogy. Now, basically, there's 3 things that genealogy and OSINT have in common. First, the type of person that likes genealogy and OSINT are usually very similar in terms of the qualities that you need and the type of things that you like. Second, the type of elements that you collect during your collection process is also very similar. And the entire cycle and the entire process of collecting and analyzing is also very similar. Now, when we're talking about a person, what kind of person likes OSINT? Well, I'm a member of the OSINT Curious team, and I've always felt that it's a really good word, because curiosity actually usually defines people who are kind of addicted to OSINT, right? Because we can't see something and not go after it. And in genealogy, it's quite the same. It's just, you start wondering, you ask your father, why did grandma didn't use grandfather's name? And then he goes, yeah, there was this history about his surname that had, and you just want to know more. And it's just something that gets into your head and you can't take it out. So definitely curiosity is something that exists in OSINT researchers and in genealogists as well, this endless search for answers. Then there's another characteristic that you almost feel that you also need very often, and believe me, you need it in genealogy as well, which is tenacity. I mean, you need to be persistent. You can't quit on the first time that you're going through I don't know how many social media platforms, and you can't find the profile of the target you're looking at, and you just want to give it a quit, and you just have to keep kind of pushing and pursuing and thinking that eventually it will pay off, because we know that most of the times it will. And you can also only have results if you have a third characteristic, which is also very important, which is the ability to step out and see things from a distance and trying to connect dots that apparently at a first sight will not look connected. So this is also something that's really important, that both genealogists and OSINT researchers will look at something like, I have someone and he's from the military, and I know that because where in a reference to him it says lieutenant. And what does that tell me? That tells me that he was probably abroad, or maybe abroad, and maybe his name or his data is in some military record. And you will do this in a normal OSINT investigation, you will do it in a genealogical investigation. Everything's about people and how they behave and how historical events and how things happening change lives of people. Like there were floods here, maybe they moved, and all this thinking about getting the data that you already have and trying to understand it in a bigger scope of what's happening in that place and at that time is important, both for OSINT researchers as for genealogists. So if you're this kind, I mean, you would probably make a really good genealogist. And yeah, you can always start. I started late, so it's never late to start. The second thing that genealogy and OSINT have in common is the issue of elements. So in both cases, we deal with two types of elements. We deal with identifiable elements, like a name and a birth date, for example, or an address, a very specific address. These are like types of data that will be very much singular about that person or a very small group of people. And usually when you have that, I mean, you may have one or two false positives, but usually it's a very identifiable lead, right? But very often people don't underestimate, and they do this in OSINT as they do in genealogy, they will underestimate contextual data. And contextual data can be like the fact that that person was in the military, or the fact that they're still single when they're like 50, for example, maybe they were a priest. Or for example, if you're looking at a HTTP header of an email, it may be like the browser the person's using, or their operating system, or their time zone. So sometimes we're focusing on the email or the IP, but we also have all this contextual data that we need to take into account when we're doing our analysis. And usually the best researchers will make the best use of combining both. So they will not only focus on that very specific email or that very specific name or birth date, but they will also look at, okay, if the person's sending me the email from this time zone, what does that mean, for example? What's off here? What's not like actually getting the dots together? So how can I analyze this and think what information here leads me to different conclusions than the ones that if I just look to identifiable data that I will have. And finally, there is a very similar process. I mean, I'm sure you're all very familiar with the intelligence cycle, and it's something that sometimes we kind of tend to forget because we're like doing our work every day, but it's never a bad idea to step back and look at a researcher doing our investigation and identify each phase and understand what you did in each phase and which ones you didn't devote too much attention or forgot or jumped through. And very often you will find small mistakes that could have led to a better like resolution of the case. Now, when we're planning an OSINT investigation, or when we're planning a genealogical investigation, we need planning and direction. Planning means that we know how much money we have. So like imagine you have a really big budget, you can go crazy, or you have just yourself for a couple of weeks or hours. and how far does the customer or the person that asked you for this research wants to go, like how much they want to invest and how far do they want to go. Do they want to know like the cousin of the cousin of the cousin, or in the case if you're doing like a veto process for a possible new employee, do they want to go like all the way back to teenage years of that employee, or they just want to know if they have like a recent criminal record. So like in both cases, we need to know exactly where the boundaries are in terms of time and how much resources we're spending. Now, another important thing is that we really need to think also about how we communicate with the person that's making the request. So very often in OSINT, and you all have this, and I have this now in genealogy, exactly the same. We will have someone that will ask us for something, but not give us everything they have. So they will go like, I really would like you to have a look in this other company that's owned by John Stewart, blah, blah, blah. And they will give you like a name and a phone or something to start with and the name of the company. And then suddenly like 3 emails later or into a phone conversation, you find out that actually the person that did the request knew that John always went on holidays to the Bahamas. Or this will happen with genealogy as well. So clients will give us their birth certificates or their grandparents' birth certificates, and they think that's enough. And they will forget to say, for example, that their grandfather was a doctor, or that, for example, they had an uncle that went to live in India. So all these details are really important. And when we communicate with the person that's doing the request, it's really important that they pass everything that they have, and that we keep asking them more questions to be sure that this has happened. Now, the second stage is about collection. And collection is so important, and that's why it's so important to start with all the contextual data that you have besides the identifiable data. And here, once again, a good genealogist, a good OSINT researcher will stand out, just because he will think a lot about where he will collect things. As you will see today during the presentation, like in genealogy, just like in OSINT, it's not like you have one website where you can just search for everything. I mean, there's Google, okay, but there isn't like a one solution. There's a lot of scattered data. Things are all over the place, and you need to really think about where you're going to search, because that process is almost as important as the search itself. So, for example, I need to think which country, which location, military records, university records, old newspapers, land, for example, properties. Where am I searching? There's no point of searching for someone who's like a doctor, for example, a lot for land registrations, because maybe they didn't have any. But looking at universities may be super relevant, because for sure they took their degree somewhere. Where was this? In which university? Where was he born? Where did he start practicing? What's the closest university? Do they have an online database? So all these questions are really important at that stage. And of course, we have processing and exploitation. Very often we have like bulks of data, and we need to filter that, and we need to organize it and understand what's important and what's not that important. And when we're doing the analysis, it's also so important that we understand the value of the evidence. And this is really important in intelligence and when you're doing an OSINT report, especially for when it has implications. So you're doing like vetting of an employee that may not get hired because of that. And there's a difference between having an idea that something's off from having evidence that something's off. And with genealogy, it's the same. Very often we will have strong evidence that, for example, this person, John Stewart, is the son of Paul Stewart and Martha. But we will have this because, for example, Paul was the godfather of his children's baptisms, and because they were living in the same address in a census that was done in 8040, whatever, and they have the same name, and they're the only ones with that last name, surname in that village. But that doesn't mean we're absolutely right. And it's really important when we write a report and when we pass it on that we very explicitly say what is our degree of certainty and what does the evidence tells us. And with OSINT, it's exactly the same. So I believe that this social media profile belongs to this target because of A, B, C, and D. But there's no way that I can be sure, for example, because there's no profile picture or because I don't have the target's picture. So all these things are really important. Of course, dissemination, in our case, for example, in our company, we always deliver the report to the client that then goes through it with a lot of joy, I like to think, to see like what's his background and what are their roots. And in our day-to-day OSINT, we will do it with a purpose for example, a client or law enforcement or, for example, journalistic investigation. Now that we've kind of seen what they have in common, you probably understand much better how did I went from going after terrorists to going after grandparents and great-great-grandparents of people, because the thought process and my personality and what I like and everything I use in everyday life is more or less the same. It's just the places where I collect things that actually change. Now, when we're talking about sources, so where do you collect the data? Can you get data? We're talking about a myriad of sources. So I think for social media platforms, there is more or less a monopoly, but for genealogical sources, it's completely scattered. And it has one characteristic, which is sometimes frustrating, which is it's very national. So usually like historical archives and everything that has to do with birth certificates or land registries are very connected to a country, for example, okay? So in this presentation, I'm not gonna go through like 100 tools from Brazil to Spain to the Netherlands to the US, because it would just be too much. We're going to focus in especially 3 or 4 types of tools that are really important, and one in specific that's very good and that's free, that has worldwide records, that takes about 5 minutes to create an account. So you can all, like at the end of this day or in the weekend, have fun, create an account. You just need an email. It can be like any email. And you will have access to billions of documents, public records, photos, and books. And that tool's Family Search. Family Search is kind of like the Facebook for genealogy. So it's probably the biggest tool and the one that has more data in it. But I would still tell you that there are some tools similar to Family Search, like MyHeritage or Ancestry.com, that also have really relevant information, but they are not free. Now, one of the things that you should remember when you're doing, in this case, OSINT, is MyHeritage and Ancestry.com, for example, are platforms where you have living people. So sometimes people will create their family profiles and they will have them public. So this is really interesting from an OSINT standpoint. I didn't bring it here today because since it's not a free tool, it would just, create all these expectations and then you can't use it. So we're going to focus on what's free, but I did wanted to warn you that, for example, MyHeritage is really worth a look, especially if you're looking at the person, the target himself or his parents or like the first generation, right? So once you create an account on Family Search, this will be like the main entrance view. Now here, what you have is a lot of options, but we're going to focus especially on one of the topics here on the top, which is search, right? Now, search allows us to go through records, images, family tree, genealogies, catalog, books, and research wiki. Now, today we're going to look at records and images only, but if you do go through this in the weekend, go through, for example, the books section, because it has loads of books, more than Google Books has, for example, or HathiTrust, which is another online book platform that we use a lot. Both Google Books and HathiTrust allow for textual search. So if you have the grandparent, for example, of someone and you want to search for them, or the parent, for example, you can do it on Google Books, you can do it on HathiTrust, and you can do it here on the Books platform or Family Search. Because if there's a book about the family where they speak about like how many children they have, where did they live, everything, and so on, sometimes it has what they did for a living, it will probably be here on the Family Search Books option, which allows for textual search as well, and very often lets you read some of the text, right? The catalog allows you to search for location, for example, and see if you're looking at birth certificates in, let's imagine, Barcelona, Spain, you can go to the catalog and just see the last years of birth certificates in Barcelona, Spain. They don't have everything in the world, but usually they will have more than anyone else. So it's free. So it's always worth to have a look, right? Now, the two things that we will have today a better look is records and images. Now, records is especially interesting. Why? Because the Family Search team has devoted a lot of time and a lot of money in indexing a lot of these registrations. So instead of going to Barcelona, Spain, because you know that your target's parents, for example, were born there, and just going through images after images, if it's indexed, if it's been seen through the Family Search team, you can actually search for their names, okay, and for the location. And you have a lot of options here, as you can see, that you can add on. So let's imagine that you have, for example, a target, and you know that his mom is Martha, but you don't know her last name. And you know his father is Paul Stewart and he's John Stewart. So probably about John, there's no records because it's still something like very recent, but you can always search, for example, for Paul Stewart with the spouse Martha living in Barcelona, Spain, for example. So these are the kind of Boolean searches that we're all used to do when we do our OSINT work, and that you can also use this. Now, what kind of results do we get? Now, Family Search has because it's free and because of privacy issues, and very well, they don't have, or they try not to have, data on living people, okay? So that means you won't find like the target's birth certificate. But if their parents or their grandparents, for example, have died, you may find, for example, their death certificate. And usually it states, for example, their children and their spouses of their children, and sometimes it even has more data. It always also has people that were born a long time ago and that the platform assumes are no longer living. So birth certificates and all of that, right? Now here, what I did was basically I took Rhode Island, which is where I wish we would all be right now, but we can't because of the pandemic. And I took the last name Narciso, which is my last name, and I just went to search, okay, let's see if I have like family members over there. So there's a lot of results. It ended up giving like 2,000, 3,000, well, a lot, but I just did a screenshot so that you can have an idea of what kind of documents you will trove. Now, some of them are in image form, some of them will just have the data, but then you will have ideas like siblings, for example. As you can see here, you will have name of the father, of the mother, of the spouse, of the children, and you get a lot of information. Now, what kind of information do you get here? For example, here we have a census of this family, and you will have like they were all living together, for example, and you will have the idea of the children, of their age, and you will start to have a timeline. So if you're looking at a person, for example, and you want to understand their personality, their profiling, and you understand that, for example, his father or his mother were one of a family of 10 siblings in which they were all super close together and they lived together until very long, that allows you to have an idea of his family support system, for example. Now, these are small details, but when you add them all together, as we will see in the end of this presentation, you will have a lot of data to work on. Then you will have things like this. So this is in Portuguese, but this is a death certificate actually from 2012, I think. 2012. So about someone that was born in 1951. It states the reason that they died, their address, it states their spouse and their children, for example. Here in the end, it says observations, she was married with, she leaves blah, blah, blah's children, and it even has the document. So as you can see here in the end, it will have their social security number, their tax revenue number, and all of that information. Just right there, just by searching for the name, for example, in this case. So this gives you also a good idea of what kind of data we can find in these types of platforms. Another thing that you also should have a look at is images. So besides records, the images are geolocated. Now here we have an example of a place in the coast of Ireland, for example, where I just put the map over it, and you can see all the databases that Family Search has for this area. So here, for example, we have school records, but it also may be like graveyard, immigration cards, birth certificates, land properties, wills, a lot of documents about that area. So if you're looking at someone that's from a specific area, or for example, if you're interested in a place in particular because you're looking at, for example, recruitment opportunities in a hostile country, this may be a really cool place to start and understand, like, how are the networks between families, how do they live, and you have a lot of information here also. Now, memories. Now, memories works a little bit like, like Facebook, like a social media platform. So just like you created a profile on Family Search, everyone creates a profile, right? And then you have like different privacy settings, and you can create your own data and put your parents on it, and up to everyone that's living, it will not share that data with other users unless you state otherwise. So you can put your parents at ease, for example, if they're still living, they won't be shown to other users. But from the moment that you start handling with people that have deceased, it will share that data with other users. It's kind of like a Wikipedia of genealogy, right? And one of the things that it allows you is to put memories and things attached, for example, to your grandparents' profile. So, for example, if I would create my grandfather's profile, I would probably put an award that he received, for example, because of the work he did on World War II. So that kind of things that you're proud of, people will put in their memories kind of folder, and that's open and public. And one of the things that Family Search allows is for you to search by keywords. So here, for example, I just search for my last name, Narciso, and you get like thousands of results. And you can, of course, filter this with other keywords. But as you can see, for example, you have graves, you have pictures, and you even have like a death certificate. So a lot of people will put like documentation into the platform, and it will be visible to others. You can also search, for example, for a location. So imagine there's a really hostile location that you really need to spend some time to do some research, like on the ground, on the field. And you really want to know more about the history of the location, or as you will see further ahead, if you need a cover story. So you can have a lot of content about that location, like what's happened in the past. Was there like a big fire? Was there like a flood? Was the leader of the city hall actually arrested because he was, I don't know, smuggling alcohol? Something like that will pop up in these kinds of researches. So this is also really useful to search for locations. Now, finally, and I would tell you that MyHeritage and other paid genealogical platforms are also really interesting to do this. People will create profiles of the people of their family, and it will happen, and it isn't that uncommon as you would think. If you have someone, a target, for example, that has an uncommon family name, or you know their ancestors, for example, and you search for them on Family Search. So if you search, you go to discover your deceased ancestors, and you search for them, and they have a profile like this gentleman. One of the things that will be possible is for you to see, for example, the person that edited and put this data into it. So imagine you were interested, for example, in this gentleman, Amadeo. So you know that this lady, Amanda, she put most of the data into it. So she's probably somehow related to him, or she's doing research about this family. And as you can see here on the right, you can also usually see the email of the person that actually put the data on. And as I will talk on later, explaining the bridges that genealogy has with social engineering, this is one of those topics where people always answer and they always talk and they always share. And it's quite amazing for me as a former intelligence officer to see how this is actually so much more effective than probably all the techniques I used in the past, like the weather or something else that would pop up in that moment. So Amanda here created this profile, or at least she put a lot of the information into it. And we could probably reach out to her and say, what did you find out about Amadeo? He's also from my family. I'm really interested in sharing information, where you're from, etc., etc. So this is really interesting. And if you do go to MyHeritage, you will have exactly the same data, for example, about the person who created the family tree. And you can also connect with them, and they will also have like a profile. So yeah, so this is a really good starting point as well. Even if it's not your target, maybe they're related, they will know him somehow, and they can give you insights about the family. Another really relevant area is newspapers. I'm showing Google News here, not because it's like the best and it has a lot, because it doesn't, but because it's so scattered and it depends on country to country. Brazil, which is a country that I work a lot, has a free database that allows for textual search from, I think, 99% of published newspapers since the 19th century. And it's completely amazing because you will write down a name and it will just give you like the obituary, the businesses that they had, the court appearance that they went to, like all of those things that will usually happen and appear on newspapers, sometimes really sad stories about murders and violence, they will all come up, right? So Google News is a good starting point, but I would always advise you to, depending on the place that you're doing your research on, the country and the location, just go onto Google. I mean, I'm sure you all, being in an OSINT conference, know how to do that. Just look for like digital newspapers, Rhode Island, or digital newspapers, Spain, or digital newspapers, Netherlands. Just go search for the databases and you will probably find them. And many of them are searchable for text. And that's really a really useful tool, because very often you will get data from like 1980, 1990, and you will have data, for example, even about the birth of your target, for example. Then we have forums. And when I say forums, I want you to think about Facebook groups. I want you to think about WhatsApp, Telegram groups, and basically all online communities surrounding a certain place and a certain surname. And this is very often. So when you have a target that has a very specific surname or is from a specific location, never forget to go search for groups or forums or Facebook groups or Telegram groups or whatever is more relevant in terms of social media in your area about that city or about that surname. So if we're talking about, for example, Providence, Rhode Island, you would search for genealogy groups about Providence, Rhode Island. Or if we're talking about a last name like Narciso, you could look for forums where there would be like threads about the Narciso surname. Now, you would be surprised, once again, in these kinds of groups, how much information people will give to each other, because it's a very, like the OSINT community, very much built into sharing and trying to help each other into getting knowledge through. So if you go into a genealogy Providence Facebook group and you ask about a certain family, you will probably get 10 times more than you would if you would just, go to the bowling group that they're in or something else. So this is really interesting because people will share a lot of their family history and they will share a lot about their contact details. So here as a picture, I just put like someone just giving an email to another user. And when I say email, we have a lot with phone numbers as well. So people will say, okay, just WhatsApp me or just text me or FaceTime me, this is my number. And very often their own profile, like in this case, this user has a username CCP, will have also more data, will have their date of birth, and will have all the threads in which they wrote something on. So you can do this also on Facebook. You can use this, try this in a WhatsApp group or a Telegram group. Just try to see what the user has written about, and usually it will give you a really cool idea about their family history and about what he's searching. So these would be like, in general, my suggestions. But these, as I showed you the image of the pyramid just right in the beginning, are the tip of the iceberg, right? So if you do want to search more, and if you do want to do some OSINT investigation, go to Cindy's list. This is a really cool resource. It's like our Start Me pages. She basically, I'm assuming it's a she because it's called Cindy's list, but well, it basically has most, I would say like 90% of genealogy links organized by theme, by topic, by kind of data. They will give you like Jewish genealogy, military genealogy, genealogy of the former Caribbean, for example, genealogy on slave societies. All of that will be very neatly organized, and you will have a lot of starting points for your research there. Now, as we're kind of like wrapping up, we're going to the core issue here, and to the thing that I want you to kind of take with you of the potential, actually, that all of this that I just talked about, and that kind of now seems, okay, I'm not sure I'm going to use that in my day-to-day. You will, because I will explain you why, okay? And why is this so important? Well, basically, it's useful to do 5 things, which basically all kind of come from social engineering base, okay? You will know more about a target. You can justify things. You can do elicitation in a much more grounded way. It makes approach so much easier, and it's one of the best starting points for a human recruitment operation. What about knowing? What can you know more? Well, let's imagine, for example, that I'm the target, right? So we don't want to like give a real example because people may be angry at me, okay? And let's imagine you're doing research on me because I've kind of decided that I'm an extreme right, kind of really radical person that really would like Hitler to come back from the dead and regain power, right? And I have this swastika tattoo, and you're really working in law enforcement, and you're really concerned about me. And you have like my CV, right? You have my CV, you know that I was born in Rhode Island, just like you saw the examples that I gave you. And this is your starting point, right? I mean, what could you find, for example, through genealogy platforms? First of all, you could find that, for example, there are not a lot of Narcisos in Rhode Island. Probably there's like, from Portuguese descent, there's probably like 8, maybe 10, maybe 20. So this would make your life easier, right? And very easily, you would probably find some possible relatives, like my grandfather, for example, or someone that you knew that was probably related, right? And imagine you find the obituary, for example, and in the obituary is my name, for example, because this is very common that like in the obituary, like the grandchildren will say, like have their name on it, just like their children. You would also find, for example, that the person that created my grandfather's profile, for example, would be like a distant aunt, like a sister of his or something like that. And she would have her email. So that would be like a good starting point as well. Imagine from that email that you go run it through Facebook, and you understand that that lady, that aunt of mine, has a Facebook profile. So maybe you haven't found my social media profile because it doesn't have my name and because I'm using some kind of sock puppet, but because you found my aunt's, and my aunt has like a really open profile, suddenly you have my profile because you just go through the messages and I say, it's a picture, aunt, you look so nice, okay? And this is very often that we can't find a social media person's profile and we forget to think about their relatives. What if I knew like their aunt's name, their cousin's name. Maybe they're easier to find. Maybe like that, I could pivot and find their social media profile. So in these kinds of things, Family Search and other genealogical platforms can be really useful. Now you have like my Facebook profile, right? And this is really cool because you have a starting point and you find something new. And you have like a timeline. You understand that I was born in Rhode Island, but actually that my entire family came from Portugal, and that they came when I was like, after I was born, like right after they came. So that actually like my entire family comes from Portugal. So the next point that you want to do is you want to go to my hometown, or you want to go and start asking questions in the group, Facebook group, or the Facebook groups related, or the Instagram accounts related to me somehow, like from family members, or maybe from a business that I was, whatever. So let's imagine you find out that my family used to own a restaurant, right? And now it's closed. Now, what can you do? You can like go to the restaurant, go to that place where it was on the street. You can take pictures. When you have all this background story about something that happened like in the 90s and in the 80s that people will not relate to like any criminal activities that I am connected today, you can go knock on doors and just go and do your reconnaissance. Or imagine you go to join a Facebook group and you need to say why you're joining. I'm a journalist, I'm a researcher, I'm doing about Portuguese cuisine in Providence, Rhode Island in the 90s. And I'm interested, why did these restaurants went bankrupt? What happened? Was there economic crisis? What families were running them? Why did it go wrong? Can you help me? And these kinds of things will open so many doors and will help you so much making the right questions, having a good cover story, and making everything plausible. So it makes it easier for you to make the right questions, to be in the right place, with a good justification for that, right? You can even ask documents, for example, if you're interested. Now, next, you're going to the street where I used to live, or you're in the Facebook group of the small town I used to live, and you want to start asking some questions, right? I mean, I was saying in the beginning, this is something that's so much better than weather and anything else that you can probably imagine to unblock conversations, especially with old people who have an amazing memory and that will tell you so much about what my family was, what happened to my family. My father was really actually very angry. He was very violent. And that's why the restaurant went bankrupt, because he was not nice to customers and people just stopped showing. And all of that kind of helps you to create a profile. She goes on vacation to this place. Actually, she's had friends and people will start talking about it. But because you're interested in the past, they will talk to you about the present without feeling guilty, because you're not asking about the present, you're asking about the past. But people will use stories of the present to understand and explain to you about the past. So that's why now she's going rogue and she's with all those Nazis, because her father was so violent, right? Now, another thing is, it not only allows you to do elicitation, but it actually allows you to do approaches to the object and his immediate surroundings. So you could actually approach the aunt that you got the email from Family Search, for example, and say, I'm doing some research about this family. Can you help me? Do you have any old documents? And you can talk with the object eventually, like with some cover story, because you're interested in trying to write a book about the family, or you're interested about this issue of the restaurants that went bankrupt. So it makes it really easy to start an approach, and people will be very keen. And you can try it if you're doubting me, but you can try it. And if you have the family tree really well built, you can even have a good cover story about yourself being like a distant cousin, because you will know that there was like this sister that just went back to Portugal, or that went to live in Brazil or in the Azores or somewhere else, that lost connection to the family. And you just go, I am the grandson of that lady. And everyone remembers her, and you have your cover story built. Now, finally, as you would probably start doing kind of like more research, and you would approach people from my surroundings, eventually myself, you would probably find out that actually my father went to Rhode Island, to the US in 74, because there was a revolution in Portugal that threw away the dictatorship, and he was very pro-fascist and connected to the dictatorship. And because he was scared of being prosecuted for that actually he took the entire family to the US, for example, right? And that I was raised in a house where probably Mussolini and all those very nice figures would be talked about every day, and how everything was ruined with democracy, for example, for my family, because they lost all their lands and all their possessions. Now, maybe you will also find out through family search that my father, for example, recently died. So this could have been like the trigger event that led me into becoming even more radicalized. I'm saying this as an example because as you build, for example, a recruitment for a human operation, these are all things that are so important so that you understand the person's motivations and how you can approach them and how you can convince them to cooperate with you. And if any of you out there are, for example, intelligence officers or have done these kinds of operations, you know that the family history, the background, the way that the person brings from their past is very often decisive in the way the person reacts to your pitch or your approach. And if you know that from before, then you have an amazing advantage. So this would be the last, not less important issue that I would point out as a really big potential of genealogical OSINT data collection, okay, in terms of social engineering. Now, just to wrap it up, and this is the last point because I know that I'm really on schedule and I'm not sure you have any questions. Please don't forget ethics, okay? This is just, one of those issues where people are really emotional about, and this has to do very often with very private issues. Like I've had, for example, a client that her father murdered her mother, and I found out through the investigation, but she didn't tell me because these are very personal issues. And to use that to your own advantage is something that should not be done lightly at all, and should be done only in issues like national security or something that's really worth to go and kind of try to find out these stories. So it also points out, and this is something, of course, that I work with every day, how much personal data we're giving to these platforms. And I'm not going to start talking about DNA because that's an issue maybe for another presentation, about people giving their DNA and their emails and just, finding their distant cousins and giving all their information. But platforms like these will have signatures, they will have land property, they will have, private data about your family, as you saw, like social security numbers. So this is also like kind of showing how this is also a vulnerability and a security issue. So if you do have these kinds of trainings and privacy trainings, try to include genealogical platforms also in the awareness courses that you're giving to people so that they are more, careful about what they share online. So I think that is it. Don't forget your ethics and boundaries, just as I said. And thank you so much for having me. It's like always a pleasure to be at Layer 8. It's like such a good conference with such a good vibe. And that was basically it, I think.